So welcome to the first public lecture of the academic year here at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. My name is Nyan Xie, and I am the acting director of the center this year. So for our first lecture, Professor Olufemi Taiwo will deliver a lecture titled Reconsidering Reparations. And in his lecture, Professor Taiwo will make a novel connection between the case for reparations and the issue of climate justice. So before I introduce Professor Taiwo, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Professor Jim Stock. Professor Stock is Errol Hutchings Burbank Professor of Political Economy in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and a member of the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he also was recently appointed Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability here at Harvard. And so we thought it would be a great start to our first public lecture to ask him to share his vision for Harvard on the topic of climate change. Professor Stock.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me. Look, I don't want to take a lot of time away from Femi's really interesting talk today, but I will just say a few words. So first, about my background. Yeah, I started at the Kennedy School, and now I'm in the economics department as well with the joint appointment. Since having the climate and energy portfolio in the White House 8 years or so ago, when I was a member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, my research has focused on climate economics and especially developing practical and durable climate policy. We already see some of the impacts of climate change around us. Those impacts include the effect of sea level rise on coastal communities, heat waves, wildfires exacerbated by the mega drought in the American West, increasingly intense rainfalls, and more. These impacts and those of the energy transition already fall most heavily on many of the communities that are least able to afford them. In some cases, communities already suffering from a legacy of proximity to fossil fuel pollution. But the effects of climate change we're seeing now aren't the new normal. The new normal is that these changes will be getting worse. In his letter on climate change engagement at Harvard last month, President Bacow wrote that Harvard must stand among world leaders in addressing this challenge. I guess it's my job to make that happen. Fortunately, here at Harvard, we already have many pockets of strength in the climate area and deep expertise. That said, there's a lot more that we can and must do. As a university, it's our job to develop ideas that matter. Frankly, we as a nation and globally haven't been making nearly the progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions that we need to, and new ideas are badly needed. It's also our job to educate. Here too, we have quite a few excellent courses in climate and related areas, but demand far outstrips supply. We need to amp up teaching, not just in the science of climate change, but in business relations, environmental justice, public policy, public health, and other realms, and I plan to help make that happen. So there's a lot to do. Fortunately, in my conversations with faculty, students, and alumni so far, there's a great deal of enthusiasm for Harvard rising to the occasion and to the level that it needs to rise to in this area. So I look forward to engaging with all of you in the future, and I also look forward to getting some of this talk this afternoon.
Professor Stock, thank you very much, and very much looking forward to engaging with you on the issue of climate change. So with that, let me introduce Professor Olufemi Taiwo. Olufemi Taiwo is an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. He completed his PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles, and before that, he completed BAs in both philosophy and political science at Indiana University. His theoretical work draws liberally from German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, histories of activism and activist thinkers, and the Black radical tradition. He's currently writing a book entitled Reconsidering Reparations that considers this argument of connecting reparations and the case for environmental justice. He's also committed to public engagement and is publishing articles in popular outlets with general readership, such as Slate and Pacific Standard, that explores the intersections between climate justice and colonialism. And before I turn it over to Professor Taiwo to make this novel connection between reparations and climate justice, I'd like to remind all of you to use the chat function in Zoom to enter questions that you would like to pose to Professor Taiwo. And please feel free to enter those questions during the context of his lecture so we may turn immediately to the Q&A. So with that, Professor Taiwo, I'm very much looking forward to hearing the connection between climate change and the case for reparations.
Thanks a lot to Professor Shea, Professor Stock, to Emily Bromley and all the people at Safford Center who made this happen. I'm very delighted to be here. I would also thank and shout out Divest Harvard. I think it's fair to say it took tireless organizing work to move things along to the point where Harvard has now announced divestment. That's very good. That's the kind of thing that we need to succeed on a large scale if we want climate justice or racial justice, as I'll go on to argue. So shout out to all the above. Here's what I think. This is what this talk is about. This talk is an adaptation from a book that I recently finished, which is publishing soon, which just makes this argument, which is that reparations requires climate justice, and that means remaking the world. And if nothing else, if I don't accomplish anything else in this talk, I just hope I can accomplish getting across that I mean this literally. When I say remaking the world, I'm not talking about changing people's attitudes about the world. I'm not talking about changing the way that we think about the world. I'm talking about the physical things, the actual institutions and infrastructures that we have that govern, direct, and organize life as we know it on this planet, human life and life in general. So that's the thing that we need to remake. That's the thing that climate justice calls us to remake, and it's the thing that racial justice calls us to remake. Another way of saying what I just said is to explain this broad perspective on what the world is, that I'm calling global racial empire for the purposes of this particular argument, but it is largely in agreement with a body of literature that has been developing over the past few decades that goes under the heading of racial capitalism, the term racial capitalism. But broadly, the claim about racial capitalism that I'd like to make about this global political and social order that we have is just the broad set of claims on the right, which is that the global social structure that has resulted from transatlantic slavery and colonialism, which you could call global racial empire or you could call racial capitalism, can be understood as a set of processes that constitute a distributive system. So advantages accumulate in the global north, racially dominant communities, and that second bullet point should say disadvantages accumulate in the global south, racially disadvantaged communities. So things like knowledge, political power, environmental security accumulate in the global north and among white people, racially advantaged communities, and disadvantages like toxins, like violence, like housing insecurity tend to accumulate in the global south and in racially disadvantaged communities. And it holds both within and across political communities. There is a broad volume. You could fill libraries with the various kinds of studies in the various social sciences that taken together imply something like this, or that I take to imply something like this. I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, but for now, I will just make you all aware that this is a claim. The second chapter of my book goes into some of that social science detail and argues for looking at the world in this way, but this is the perspective that I'm taking. So another way to say what that means for our purposes today is that the world, what the world is on this view, is a production and distribution system. Racial injustice then, accordingly, is about how things are distributed. Things like security, so insecurity or security with respect to housing, food, energy, water, environment. Things like political power, resources, money, and changing those distributions is the way that I'm thinking of racial justice. So if transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the racist world order, if it is the set of historical events that explains why all of those aforementioned things are distributed in the way that they are, and the processes that we would have to interrupt or change in order for them to be distributed somehow else, then the proper task of reparations, I'm arguing, is no smaller, is to rebuild the world. And this view is not as ascendant as it once was, but Adam Getachews' book, World Making After Empire, argues that the world of the 60s and the post-Second World War anti-colonial movement, in which much of Asia and Africa had successful national independence struggles, began with this recognition. It was actually something of a consensus view, or at least a plurality view amongst the global activists against that form of anti-racism and anti-colonialism. So I'm less thinking of a new thing and more trying to cheerlead for an old consensus in anti-racist, anti-colonial struggle. So in order to argue that we should look at reparations in this way, as opposed to other ways, it's helpful to point out what the other ways are that people do look at reparations, and give some reasons, try to persuade people to look at reparations in this way that is more constructive. Indeed, I call it the constructive view. In service of that, I've put together 3 standards for evaluating reparations arguments in something like lexical order. So the first standard is the most important, second standard is second most important, and third standard is least important. The first, I argue, is that reparations for global racial empire should make tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives. We are responding to the moral urgency of present day suffering, and not simply the fact of past injustice and evil. And this is part and parcel of what we should want out of reparations. But nevertheless, 2, reparations for global racial empire should address the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism to the extent possible. I add that last caveat because, unfortunately, many of the people who were most directly harmed by things like the transatlantic slave trade are, of course, people who have passed away, who are ancestors now. And so there are kinds of redress that are no longer possible because people die and pass on. But to the extent that the actual constituent events, the acts of enslavement, the acts of family disruption, the acts of taking land and territory can be remedied, this is also a desideratum for reparations views. A reparations view that can do that is a valuable one. And finally, number 3, reparations for global racial empire should discriminate. The way that they distribute benefits and burdens should be based on the different relationships of persons and institutions to the core moral wrong. The present day inheritors of the wrongdoers should get more of the burdens, perhaps all of the burdens, depending on your view of reparations, and the present day inheritors of the wronged should get all of the benefits or most of the benefits, again, depending on your view. So with these in mind, we can look at 2 categories of reparations arguments that I think much of the present day academic literature tends to gravitate towards, but not exclusively the academic literature, of course, but nevertheless, ones that I think we can improve upon. So first, harm repair. On the harm repair interpretation of reparations, the point of reparations is to repair present harms to individuals or groups that are caused or constituted by past harms. These views work on welfarist motivations and also a conception of harm that matches. So welfarist motivations are trying to make present day people, for example, the descendants of African Americans who were enslaved, they're trying to make them better off, more wealthy, or have better income, or have better housing, or less incarceration, things of that nature. So the motivations are welfarist, and accordingly, the way that harm is thought about is also welfarist. So the kind of commitments to what harm is and when we see it that match things like tort law or injury law. And accordingly, a lot of the arguments in academic literature that make these sorts of arguments come out of law reviews. There are particularly difficult conceptual questions in reconciling this conception of harm with the kind of timescale that we're talking about when it comes to reparations. I actually have a few slides prepared about that I talk about when I talk about this chapter in particular. I'm happy to go through them at the end I'm happy to go through them in Q&A. But for now, I'm just going to note that there is something many philosophers have called the non-identity problem, or the conceptual worry, the counterfactual worry that plagues harm repair arguments. But for now, I'll content myself to apply the standards. I think harm repair arguments tend to do well on standards 1 and 3 because they're welfarist in motivation. What they are about is making tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives. So they do well on standard 1, and they discriminate. They certainly do discriminate. They pick some people out as plaintiffs and other people out as defendants or analogous positions to those. And so they apportion benefits and burdens in ways that match people's moral intuitions. Nevertheless, I think they fail on standard 2. And the reason why they fail on standard 2 is intimately connected to the contention that I started with, that the other side of transatlantic slavery and colonialism isn't just wrong people in the world, but actually a world is generating the political and social system that we have with a fair degree of breadth and depth, right? It is how we got this overall social system. So the harm repair theorists would have to argue that we would be changing the kind of social system we have by redistributing wealth in particular countries or regions in the way that they're arguing for. And I don't see that as being the necessary upshot of harm repair arguments, at least not of harm repair arguments as such. So I don't think they do quite as well on standard number 2. Partially because of that thorny counterfactual worry, or the non-identity problem that I identified earlier, some theorists have opted for this second category of style of argument for reparations that I've taken to calling relationship repair. On this view, what reparations is for is repairing damage to relationships between groups where those relations have been damaged by past wrongdoing. There are a couple variants of this. Again, this is something I'm happy to return to in Q&A if need be, but they come down to differences in the ways that we could categorize the relationship between the different groups of citizens, perhaps, or between the affected citizen and their government. What is it that's going wrong because of these past moral injustices? Maybe we have a kind of debtor-creditor relationship where the present-day inheritors of yesterday's moral wrongs, or the claim rights generated by yesterday's moral wrongs, are owed something, right? They've inherited this moral debt. And so the way that the relationship is fixed by reparations is simply the way that a debtor-creditor relationship is fixed. You owe me a debt. We have a kind of broken relationship until you pay that debt. And once we do, that makes a possibility for maybe more peaceable relationships, or even more broadly moral relationships. The other argument strategy in this heading is moral repair, that just focuses on the normative aspects of relationships from the first instance. On this view, the point of reparations is primarily expressive and communicative. as Shauna Schifrin, one such theorist, puts it. So the idea is to repudiate the past and to communicate the intentions for non-repetition of the harm, for jointly held and jointly used moral and normative expectations, and so on and so forth. So we're trying to reset the normative underpinnings of a relationship between two groups of citizens, or between an affected group of citizens and a government, between the affected group of citizens and a corporation, whatever the cases may be. So, excuse me. One objection is that this changes the subject. As Coleman Hughes once put it, Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools. So you can hear the underlying welfarist kind of contentions and commitments from underlying this objection. Harm repair theorists and relationship repair theorists have often duked it out, as well as people like Reed and Hughes, who object to the whole project of reparations whole cloth. Regardless of whether or not that objection is successful, I think that the relationship repair view doesn't do a good job of the first two criteria. It's unclear what the tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives would be. It's unclear which differences would be made by the kinds of things that would communicate differences in moral opinion with the past villains of the transatlantic slave trade or attendant global colonial domination. If the core moral wrong is the construction of a whole political field, a whole political system, a construction of a world, as I'm putting it, again, it's not clear what communicative or expressive disagreement with past decisions would do in and of itself to reconstitute the world. I think people who have maybe less materialist commitments than I do might well disagree with how well the relationship repair view does on these first two. If you think that the world is strongly ideologically constructed, or that the ways that we think about political reality feed back strongly into distributions of income, distributions of political opportunity, then you may come down differently than I have. I'm just flagging that so that we can talk about it in Q&A if people are interested. But it does well on the third criterion. It asks for apologies for some people and for other people to receive apologies. So it has a good way of discriminating. The view that I prefer is this, the constructive view. What reparations is about on this view is a political project to create the just world tomorrow. And it looks backwards, looks to the past to decide how the benefits and burdens of that project, that construction project, should be distributed. So it's a constructive view, not really a repair view. It's not that we're trying to undo something that has been done in the past, but we're trying to do something in the future in a way that is mindful of the past. Accordingly, the view on justice that fits this is the aforementioned distributive approach, rather than, say, retributive justice, as maybe is befitting the harm repair approach. Some people have suggested to me that this is itself a relationship repair view. I'd be happy to call it a material relationship repair view. I don't think much hangs on this distinction. But what is worth noting is the division of theoretical labor that informs the constructive view. So forward-looking considerations, the kind of considerations that might be the topic of ideal theory, those can help us identify a target state of affairs. But transitioning from this unjust world to that target state of affairs is going to require benefits and burdens that are about the particular kinds of troubles and challenges that we have in this world as presently constituted, and as presently constituted by past injustices. So if we want to transition from this unjust world to a just world in a way that is itself just, backward-looking considerations can help us do that. The people who have been enriched by past injustice might have more lifting to do when it comes to getting us to this different, hopefully better world. Now, even my preferred view, much as I would like it to be otherwise, does not do well on all of these criteria. In particular, it doesn't do well on the third criterion. If the constructive view asks us to remake the entire world, it asks us to do something that is very difficult to contain the positive results of. If we achieve climate justice for everybody, then the descendants of the enslaved and enslavers alike are going to benefit from the achievement of that goal. And if we're going to do that, we may need to less than totally distribute the burdens of that process towards those who have benefited from past injustice. It may be that everybody is required to do something, even if not everyone is required to put in the same amount of effort or give up the same amount of resources, or so on and so forth. So my view doesn't discriminate nearly as well as the other two views do. So the ranking of these standards, the kind of order in which I put them, is a load-bearing aspect of the argument that I put forward. So just identifying that to help people challenge me or have questions or whatever. So we have the three views. We have the view that I'm trying to push for. But maybe we only have two views of reparations. So one objection that I fielded a lot is that it's not even clear that the constructive view is a reparations view at all. Reparations views are supposed to be backward-looking. They're supposed to be responses to past injustice. But if I'm saying that we should achieve justice in the future, that's a goal that we could achieve whether or not it was true that transatlantic slavery and colonialism had built this present world. We could just want justice. So distributive justice accounts are forward-looking in this particular sense. My response is that this division is artificial if you are talking about changing from a present state of the world to a future potentially just state of the world. What that present state of the world is the accumulated result of social processes. So if the view of distributive justice that we have takes this into account, if it is a historical or processual view of distributive justice, Nozick is the famous person who has a view like this, but there are others. But if we have such a view of distributive justice, then what it would be to achieve a just future state of the world would involve a trajectory starting from injustice and reaching justice, and would be thus backward looking in at least that kind of sense. So I think the artificial distinction between forward-looking and backward-looking accounts of which forms of political orders are just is unhelpful to thinking about reparations and to categorizing which views are properly reparations views. The last thing, but in some ways perhaps the most important thing I want to say about the constructive view, is the kind of additional theoretical architecture I've added to flesh out what it is that we would be distributing to make a just world. So there are resourcist views of distributive justice that think the focal variable for distributive justice should be something like income or perhaps wealth. There are resourcist views that are not so narrowly economically focused. Rawlsian primary goods gives us a good example of that. And obviously all of these are onto something, But I actually prefer the way of thinking about it advanced by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, the capabilities view. So for them, what's important about our political structures are what they allow people to do. Capabilities are just capacities to achieve functionings, which are states of being, like the state of being well fed. You can decide not to eat, and thus decide not to achieve the functioning of the state of being well fed. But if food is available, then you have the capability of being well fed. And maybe that's the kind of thing we should be paying attention to politically. Why this matters, I think, is that it changes the focal variables within distributive justice from things like resources, which of course the resources views prefer, to things like affordances. So here I'm taking cues from disability justice scholarship, for example, the scholarship on the concept of universal design. But if you want to make the world less ableist, not the world as in the way that people think about the world, though certainly we would want to change people from having ableist viewpoints to the extent that we can reason people out of these perspectives. But if you really want to make the world accessible to people, you could distribute the idea that ramps are important, or you could just build some, right? Or you could distribute the idea that closed captioning should be provided, or you could just provide it, as the people hosting this talk have fully done, right? Those things are affordances for a variety of reasons. I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. I don't think they're very well represented as resources, but they are built aspects of the social system that we can directly intervene upon, before waiting for anybody to change their minds about things. And I will just flag for the moment that some of these affordances are directly related to governance. So if you build a participatory budgeting system, or a lotocracy, or forms of political decision-making by sortition, you directly change what kinds of things people have the political power to affect in their lives. You add political affordances to your governance system. And those are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about if we're trying to achieve a just world, rather than just income distributions and so on and so forth, which we certainly should include as important targets of political intervention. So the targets are self-determination, as referenced on that political slide, or sorry, on the previous slide. We should want people to be able to interact with each other on terms of equality. This is an argument famously made by Elizabeth Anderson. Elizabeth Anderson made it in the context of a nation state, but I'm thinking about this internationally for reasons that I've gone over. These are design objectives. These are things that our social system, as a system, these are principles that would be built into our system as a system, and not just moral principles for the way that we think about the system, or the way that we criticize our system, or the kind of ideals that we communicate about our system. We should be making it literally true about how the social system operates, that people can self-determine. And that is, I think, just a restatement of the capabilities view in terms of self-determination, which is a political value that has a long history and currency in the anti-colonial movement. I think these are just identical as far as I can tell. So here's where we get to climate. If we think that what is needed are affordances and capabilities, and we see the kinds of challenges being raised by the climate crisis, we see the kinds of problems for which resources views of distributive justice are, I think, particularly poorly equipped to handle. Right? If you have the money to afford the right kind of education, but your school is burned to the ground or underwater, or there are heat waves that prevent students from safely walking to school, then it is of little consequence that they have the supposedly requisite resource, or to put it another way, they do not have the supposedly requisite resources, despite having what might otherwise seem like a just distribution of income or a sufficient distribution of income. So how do we protect the precarious gains of previous racial justice struggles in a world that is 3 or 4 degrees warmer? How we can expect the near future world to respond to the political developments of the accumulations from 1492 to present is on terms of what some people are calling climate apartheid, or what I've called climate colonialism. I don't think we need to argue about which term to use. I think they're primarily the same thing. So we can expect a new kind of social division and distributive justice problems between within countries and communities, between those individuals and families who can pay to avoid the worst impacts of climate crisis and those who can't. And we can make that same insight with social groups of different sizes. So there will be differences in the abilities of whole nations or indigenous nations, indigenous communities to deal with climate crisis. And the differences between those who can afford to deal with these problems and those who cannot will increasingly structure the kinds of political divides and divisions that we get in the near future. So we have a large planet-sized system to change. Part of what we need to change is ecological, part of what we need to change is political, and part of it is cultural. How do we change all these things on a literally planetary scale? Well, to recall, this whole talk I've been using this distributive approach. So I'm thinking of racial justice and injustice in terms of how things are distributed, things like security, political power, including resources and money, but not limited to resources and money. So climate reparations would be in outside of the abstract land of theory and into the real world 2021 set of policy disagreements. It would be more program than a policy. So generally, it would be an achievement of climate policy in all of the relevant areas if the burdens were to be distributed towards the global north and the racially advantaged population, and the benefits of all of these things distributed towards the global south and Black and indigenous populations. That would cut across the going categories of climate policy. If you have done some reading in that area, you recognize these terms from there: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, resettlement, carbon removal. And if you've done some reading in these areas, you're probably also aware that the exact opposite is happening. The countries that are putting more than their fair share of efforts towards mitigation and adaptation are often countries towards the most disadvantaged side, or the disadvantaged pole of all of the countries in our global system of geopolitics. And large, rich nations are doing less than their fair share. So in what little time that remains to me, I'm just going to go through a few concrete policy ideas that I think fit the constructive view ethos, just to flesh out a little bit what the upshot of this view is. And then I will be happy to talk with you all about any of the things that I've said over the past few minutes. But first and foremost is the good old unconditional cash transfer. I think this is the policy instrument people think of when they think of reparations, particularly harm repair theorists, who I earlier criticized, but I think they're just entirely correct on this particular aspect of things. This is the gold standard of reparations discussions for a reason. Just giving people checks is an extremely direct way to change who has claim rights on the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. It's a great idea. If we do nothing else, we should do this. There have been a lot of objections to this, some stemming from a general concern with cultures of dependence or something like that, some more technocratic, some thinking that it will be inflationary. There are some objections that kind of straddle the middle of the technocrat and cultural critic. There are some people who think unconditional cash transfers, just mailing checks to everybody, will be vulnerable to one form of capture or other, perhaps by landlords who immediately raise the rent, perhaps by monopolies, perhaps by the business owners for whom recipients of reparations checks are consumers. I think there are real things worth worrying about in these objections, but they're not the sort of objections that are knocked down. In particular, I think Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen's recent proposal to have trust funds dispersed over time and administrative apparatus checking in on all these things, a national reparations board. I think that's an extremely well thought out proposal, and I think we should just do it. Great idea. Immigration justice. The status quo is warehousing refugees in much of the world. The status quo used to be resettlement policy. We should go back to that, and we should greatly liberalize borders asymmetrically. So particularly for south to north migration. There's lots to say there, but perhaps I'll leave it for Q&A. Participatory budgeting. This gets back to the kind of practical affordances that give people direct decision-making power over their economic life. We can bring public funds under public control. So in 1988, after 20 years of military dictatorship, the Brazilian Workers' Party in Porto Alegre brought a majority of the municipal funds of the city under public control, under direct public control. So there were something like town hall meetings where people decided what the money should be used for, and they did that, and they gave people direct kind of power over these things. That is something that has been adopted by many cities. Very few have committed even a fraction as much funding as the Brazilian Workers' Party did. Seville, Spain, for example, from 2005 to 2009, contributed some 4% of city funds to participatory budgeting processes, and that was on the higher end for the time. Right? So a far cry from the Brazilian Workers' Party. One exception being the state of Kerala in India, which where a left democratic alliance of leftist parties is a powerful political force there. It's gameable. The political ecology matters. It matters what kinds of community organizations there are and what the prevailing civil society organizations say about such things and to what extent they make themselves part of the process. But I think this is something that we should look into. Energy democracy or community control over power. Private fossil fuel companies, if you ask me, should not exist. Why do we have those? We have those, we're going to continue to have problems. But community ownership of power is another way forward. Rather than having investor-owned utilities who externalize the environmental costs of their profit seeking, often by dumping pollution on marginalized communities. We can make people decide or put people in the driver's seat of deciding how power is going to be provided. And we can empower people to be able to do that with renewable energy and renewable resources. One more thing to mention, bargaining for the common good. This is actually an approach to workers organizing. It's an approach where organized labor includes community members and organizations in the generation of contract demands and the campaign to win them. Labor unions played large roles in desegregation, and there's a long US labor history, especially amongst public sector workers, using worker power for broader social goals. And that's something we've started to see in the last decade with teachers unions and several locals of the SEIU in the United States. And it's something that I think also has the possible upside and upshot of increasing people's self-determination. It's also the kind of affordance that can change the power dynamics of a social system. I'm not going to explain any of these. I'm just going to rattle them off for potential comment and Q&A. We could be here a long time. I wish I had revisited this after the Pandora Papers were released. I'd have a few more bullet points to say under tax haven reform, but fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty speaks for itself. Green Climate Fund, a fund by which rich countries can pay money into green development of poorer countries, reforming tax havens, restructuring trade policy. All of these hopefully just give you a flavor of how literally I mean when I say that remaking the world is what's required for climate justice and racial justice. And this stuff, not just checks to particular people, is the stuff of reparations. So again, if I've said anything over the past half hour or so, hopefully I've said this. Reparations requires climate justice, and that means literally remaking the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Taiwo. Everybody please join me, although we can't hear the clapping. We're gonna clap on behalf of the audience. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So what I thought I would do is read from some of the questions that have been submitted during the talk. And the first one I think will be helpful, which is, I'm curious as to whether your view takes the demands of climate justice and those of reparations to be properly coextensive. I imagine you don't think it's merely contingently true that the global South is owed reparations and is also most directly burdened by climate change. But I'd love to hear your thoughts spilled out a little bit more on the connection between the two.
I think that's right. So I don't just think it's contingently true that the global South is owed reparations and that they are most vulnerable to the downsides of climate crisis. My view of what it comes to that they're most vulnerable to the downside of climate crisis is a view on which the social structure that we've inherited from historical processes, which is itself an accumulation of power and resources and money, that is, if not decisive, at least a large causal input into who is vulnerable to what, right? So everyone was vulnerable to COVID qua virus because we're all the kinds of creatures that can catch the COVID, that can contract COVID from the SARS-CoV-2 virus. But not all countries were by dint of their place in the global system of production and distribution, equally vulnerable. Some countries had a large formal sector, a large tax base with which they could pay people to stay home. Some countries could had substantial credit ratings with which they could borrow. Some countries, some organizations, some people were essential workers. Some people were, essential workers. Some people were given the opportunity to stay at home and work. And all of those things are contingent results of the particular way that our social system has developed. And so they show up in response to a supposedly novel crisis in ways that look like it's bad luck if you're ignoring the history that explains why vaccine production is over there, is possible over there, but impossible over here, and so on and so forth. And the climate crisis is case in point, something that was produced by the Industrial Revolution, which was itself produced by transatlantic slavery and colonialism. And the things that render populations most vulnerable to the effects of the climate crisis are of that same kind that I just explained with the vaccine.
Okay, great. Here's a question that relates to your third standard for an account. It says, could you say more why your constructive distributive justice doesn't fully meet your third standard? I felt that it could with the right balance of backward and forward approach as distributive justice on the basis of disabilities or other injustices which repeat in every generation. It seems very different to injustices on the basis of theft, which is what reparations are for.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't think it's true. Let me put it this way. I think it would be possible to design a kind of political program around the constructive view that that succeeded at standard 3. So you could decide which affordances to build and where to build them, right? So for example, you could exclusively take up climate adaptation projects in the global South and in frontline racially marginalized communities in the global North, right? And that would be discriminatory in perhaps the right sense, and thus maybe it would fulfill standard 3. So yeah, that is a good point. I don't think it's conceptually impossible, but I think a harm repair view qua harm repair view succeeds at standard 1, right? And a relationship repair view qua relationship repair view succeeds at standard 3. And it's only, I think, contingently possible that the constructive view could succeed at standard 3. So I think, yeah, if I had been more careful, I would have put it that way. So I take the point.
Great. So sort of continuing on that line of how to be sort of discriminating, I think this is sort of a combination of 2 questions, which is I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts about how this approach towards reparations applies to environmental justice communities that are a mix of both immigrants, refugees who have escaped their home country, say, for example, in Central and South America, due to US imperialism, as well as African Americans who are descendants of those who were enslaved. And then sort of continuing on that with another question, which is, since the present world was created by many different types of injustices, and not just racial domination, could there also be reparations for, say, gender injustice, where the cost is paid by men and the benefits to women and gender non-conforming persons on a constructive view? Or maybe the international multiracial working class is owed reparations, or can reparations be owed only to peoples or ethno-racial groups? So those are sort of 2 questions about how extensive, in some sense, is the constructive approach.
Yeah, and they're 2 interestingly related questions. Maybe on maybe thinking about different scales or starting from different scales. So maybe I'll start with the second one. But broadly, what I want to say about both of them is that yes, you could think of a politics around reparations that could respond in different ways to these kinds of challenges. and maybe we should. So taking the case of gender, for example, I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't have a kind of reparatory politics for gender, and there have, this is an idea that has been floated to some extent, and on the constructive view, what reparations comes to is maybe most dramatic in terms of some people get checks and some people don't, right? Which is kind of the more colloquial, more commonplace thinking about what reparations is. But all it comes to on the particular view that I've identified here is on purpose distributing the benefits and burdens in targeted ways that track past injustices. And we could certainly do that, right? We could build spaces where that were presumptively for non-men, or we could build institutions that dealt in compensatory ways for with non-men as a response to the past history of gender injustice. And I don't see any particular reason not to do that. By that same token, you could have a number of heterogeneous policy approaches in a kind of mixed community, right? So maybe there's a set amount of funding that comes in for a community where some people are the descendants of American slavery and some people are immigrants from some place that has been affected by US empire, Haiti, for example. And maybe one group of those people gets checks, the former, but maybe the whole community gets climate adaptation work. The whole community gets better water management systems, for example. That kind of thing is not only compatible with the constructive view, I think that's the kind of central case of the constructive view. Right? We all live together in some sense of together. There's only the one planet, but we all have these different relationships to the vast array of injustices that built the modern world, and that is not only okay, but that fact is usable in designing just ways to change the world.
Great. We are now at time, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but I hope maybe people will be able to have a chance to read your book and then respond as well. So once again, everybody, please join me in thanking Professor Taiwo for an incredibly stimulating talk. And please do look at our newsletters and our website for future events. And we very much look forward to seeing you at the next public event. Once again, thank you very much.